Mr. Chairman.
Articles of Confederation now resolve this convention. The national government ought to be established.
Consent to this Constitution.
Welcome back for Lesson 5, The Miracle at Philadelphia. The Founding Fathers carefully scrutinized every system of government in existence to see which one was the most likely to make it possible for humanity to attain the three goals of freedom, prosperity, and peace. But among all the political systems of the day, there was no such government around the globe. Every government was structured to exploit its people and reduce them to poverty. No existing government was designed to provide its people with freedom, prosperity, and peace. Therefore, the founders sat down to invent one. As it turned out, the American formula was much more like a restoration of what Jefferson called the ancient principles than an entirely new invention of something brand new. Nevertheless, even after the founders had discovered these principles, it still required the utmost ingenuity at the Constitutional Convention to fit them into the requirements of modern society. Now, when the founders first gathered in Philadelphia, it was a frightening experience. And that's your first blank for this lesson, frightening. And here's why. It's because the unity, your next blank, unity that had existed among the colonies had all but disappeared. And they began treating each other like foreign nations. And there was deep depression. Depression's your blank for letter B, depression. And the states were quarreling. Quarreling's your blank for letter C. Quarreling over fishing rights and navigation rights and all these things. And so they are treating each other as foreign nations. Foreign's your next blank. In fact, in order to go from one state to the next, you had to sometimes go through customs and pay tariffs if you were bringing goods and things from one state to the next. And so can you imagine how expensive things started getting, going throughout the states? And so then they started shipping it, and then they started getting upset about navigation rights and things because they were bypassing all those tariffs and whatnot. And so it really became a problem among the colonists. Letter E, Spain was threatening to seize territory along the Mississippi River. Mississippi River, your blank there. England wouldn't remove her troops. In fact, she didn't finally remove her troops until toward the end of Washington's second term. So England stayed around for quite some time. Such hostility is your next blank there in letter G, had developed among the states that New England was threatening to secede from the Union. And what's worse, the southern states were saying, good riddance. We don't need you, right? And so this was definitely becoming a problem. It was obvious that the Articles of Confederation were a failure. Failure is your next blank there. So it was important that they strengthen the federal government. And so they decided to start calling a convention, but it was almost a miracle. Miracle is your next blank there, that a convention actually took place. George Washington was one of the first to start calling for the convention, and he started encouraging Congress to call one, and nothing came of it. Nothing is your blank for letter B. Now, during this time, this is when George Washington received a letter from one of his officers asking him to become King George I of the United States. And what a remarkable story that is. In fact, this book, The Miracle of America, this is a wonderful kind of coffee table picture book kind of thing where you've got these great pictures and things, the Founding Fathers, and you've got these wonderful stories. Remember that story that I told you at the very beginning of Lesson 1 about Reverend Prince in the Old South Church? So that story right there. This nice picture of Reverend Prince there and giving his prayer. And so that story can be found in The Miracle of America. Well, this other book I want to just read directly from here because it's just very inspiring. It has to do with George Washington, what he called his worst ordeal. Now, this is worse than all the winters that he spent during the Revolutionary War. This was worse than some of the betrayal that he had from some of his other generals who were trying to take his position from him. His worst ordeal is this event. 7 months after the battle at Yorktown, Washington received a most disturbing letter from one of his officers outlining the military's grievances with Congress and the consideration of a possible military revolt. Congress had failed to honor its promises made to the Army concerning salary and pensions. the officer pleaded with Washington to accept the crown and serve as King George I of the United States. Horrified, Washington wrote back immediately denouncing the idea. America had come too far to return to tyranny. Washington's strong feelings did not pacify the rumbling restlessness of the military, which called for a military revolt with or without Washington. In a meeting of officers on the subject, Washington reviewed their grievances and expressed a determination to work with Congress for a just solution. Washington saw that the officers were still sullen and silent. Having failed to persuade them, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a letter from Congress explaining the financial difficulties of the government. In their seats, the officers shifted uncomfortably. Suddenly, every heart missed a beat. Something was the matter with their commander. He seemed unable to read the paper. He paused in bewilderment. Fumbling in his waistcoat pocket, Washington took out a pair of reading glasses, something that only his closest friends had seen him wear. He then said quietly, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray in the service of my country, but blind also." This simple statement achieved what all of Washington's arguments had been unable to accomplish. The officers were deeply moved and shed tears of affection. They had great admiration for their aging general who had led them all so far for so long. Washington quietly finished reading the letter, walked out of the hall, mounted his horse, and disappeared from view. Washington's officers realized that they had followed their leader into battle for the cause of liberty, and they would follow him once again into the next battle to determine if they could become a self-governing people. Now remember when we talked in a previous lesson about Cromwell and Cromwell taking power, and I mentioned that most often in history, when the people turn so much power over, it ends up corrupting. And I mentioned that there are only a few occasions, and this is one occasion in which that did not happen. George Washington had all the power that he needed to become the king of the United States. He was an honorable man who had a tremendous amount of love for his country, and he could have figured out, I should do this because I can help protect the country and I can help save it and shore it up. But no, he recognized, and when you read his writings, it's interesting what he says. He recognized that America is not to have a king because America already has a king. He said, "Our king shall be the God of heaven." And so that was George Washington's position. That's why he resigned and went back to private life. In fact, there was an artist that was in King George's court, and King George asked him, he said, "What is to become of George Washington now that he has won the war?" And the American artist said, "I don't know. They say that he is going to retire and return back to Mount Vernon to live out the rest of his life as a private citizen." And King George said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man alive." So even King George recognized the significance of George Washington having received all this power to fight the war. He then went and handed that power over to Congress, returning it back to the people who had given it to him. What a remarkable event that George Washington, what a great example. So nothing came of him, of them wanting to become a king, but also nothing came of him wanting a constitutional convention. And so what ended up happening was you ended up having a couple states that were arguing so much that they couldn't get along, and they tried to send delegates to work things out with each other. And a couple of states were Virginia and Maryland primarily. They were arguing over navigation and fishing rights on the Potomac River. And they got so angry with each other that they refused to meet or to go into each other's states to meet. And so what did they do? They met on a boat in the middle of the Potomac because they wouldn't step foot. And so Washington, when he heard this, he said, this is appalling. He said, we've got to change this. So he invited the delegates from Virginia and from Maryland to come on up to Mount Vernon. He said, come on up. We'll sit on the back porch. We'll sip a little something, and we'll talk this through. And so they did. The great general had invited them to his home. And so they came and they discussed it, and they said, this is pretty good. We can work through this. We can talk this through. And so Virginia and Maryland and other states realized they could probably work this out. And so they went ahead and called a convention of the states, but it was a trade convention. Trade is your next blank for letter C, trade. The problem was, this took place in Annapolis. The problem was only 5 states showed up. So 5 is your next blank there. Now the reason why this was a problem, because the Articles of Confederation had a provision in it. When it talked about amending the Articles, there were some requirements. Do you know what percentage of vote they needed from the states in order to amend the Articles of Confederation? 100%. That's right, 100%. And so, is that majority rule? That's not. That's actually minority rule, because one state can hold all the other states hostage, and that was usually Rhode Island. Rhode Island was just kind of a thorn in the side of the other states. Rhode Island was very independent. Rhode Island very rarely even sent delegates to Congress, and so Rhode Island prevented the other states from being able to alter the Articles of Confederation in many cases. It wasn't always Rhode Island's fault, but mostly. And so that was a problem. So only 5 states showed up, so they couldn't make any changes to the Articles of Confederation. So what they ended up doing was what came out of it, because they talked some things through and they did work out some stuff and came up with some resolutions, even though they weren't binding. And they said, this is good. We can do this. We can work through this. And so the one good thing that came out of the trade convention in Annapolis was they convinced Congress to go ahead and call a constitutional convention. Well, they didn't call it a constitutional convention at the time. It was actually called the Grand Convention. And they called that, and they were to meet. Each state was to send delegates to Philadelphia in May of 1787. So altogether, 73 delegates were appointed, but only 55, which is your blank for letter B there, only 55 attended. Now, the reason why it was 73 appointed, only 55, because most of the states didn't have any money to pay them to be there or to pay them while they were there. And so a lot of them couldn't afford it. They couldn't put their affairs in order. They had to stay home and work, whatever. Also, some of them refused because they disagreed with this convention. For example, Patrick Henry was a delegate from Virginia, and he refused to go because he thought that we just needed to keep all the power in the states. Articles of Confederation were fine, and he didn't want to increase the power going to the central government. So he refused to attend. But 55 actually participated. The 2 most important members there were George Washington and James Madison. And both of them had to borrow money to get there and to stay there. And so that kind of shows you how difficult it was for some of them to be there. So eventually every state sent delegates except for one state, Rhode Island. And so the founders began calling her Rogue, which is your blank there, Rogue Island. Right? So Rogue Island was not present. But other than that, the other 12 states sent delegates. Because of personal circumstances, George Washington almost didn't attend. His health wasn't doing all that well. There was also a veterans organization that he was like the honorary president or chairman of, and they were having a big event in Philadelphia, and he had already told them that he couldn't be there because his health, but also because he really was hesitant about this veterans organization becoming too big or too prominent, because he didn't want the country to think that the military was planning on any kind of military coup. And so he didn't want to go. And so he had already told them he could not go to that event that was in Philadelphia, and now the very same time, the Constitutional Convention, so he was stuck. Because if he went, then it was just going to look pretty bad. Eventually, he put his personal feelings and opinions aside and ended up going to the Constitutional Convention. Benjamin Franklin, letter E, was 81 years old. He was very old and couldn't walk very well, had gout, had a lot of problems there. So he was actually carried to and from the convention. Luckily, he lived right there in Philadelphia. Now, there are 2 very significant founders that were not present. The first one there, you're blank for number 1, John Adams. John Adams was serving as the minister to England, or the diplomat. And Thomas Jefferson, number 2. He was serving in France. And it's a good thing that both of those men weren't there, because they were pretty strong-headed, especially Adams. And this was a time to really be able to work together. But their presence was most definitely felt, because John Adams had wrote the Constitutions of the United States of America. It was a book that basically analyzed all these different constitutions. And that was one of the most quoted books at the Constitutional Convention. So John Adams was definitely present in that sense. And then Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was present through his protege, James Madison. James Madison wanted to be very well prepared for the convention, and so James Madison wrote his friend and his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, and said, please send me some books. Well, he sent books, not just one or two, but by the hundreds. And so Madison went through those books, and he became so well prepared that all the other founders recognized him as the most able among them. Able is your next blank. Let's see, 8 is your next blank, and then able. James Madison was 8 years younger than Thomas Jefferson, and he was considered the most able among them. So it officially opened on May 25th with 7 states present, and then eventually all the other states except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island is your next blank there. And they began to work through some of their issues. And basically the issue that they started working through is James Madison had gotten there early, and a number of the Virginia delegates were there early as well, and it gave him time to prepare 15 resolves or 15 resolutions that basically became known as the Virginia Plan. Sometimes it became known as the Randolph Plan because it was Governor Edmund Randolph that actually presented the plan in the convention. And that basically became the plan that was debated and argued and eventually became the Constitution. That's why James Madison is recognized as the father of the Constitution. He never liked that title. He said many other people were involved with this, but nevertheless, that's what history calls him. Now, your history teachers and government teachers, they always probably told you that the Constitution was basically a bundle of compromises, right? And that's really not a very accurate portrayal of what took place there. There were some compromises. There's 3 to be exact, major compromises. But the rest of them were basically just kind of working out consensus. Now, there's a big difference between consensus and compromise. How would you define consensus?
Changing your mind.
General agreement. Changing your mind, willing to kind of, give a little, take a little until you both kind of come to the general agreement. What's a compromise? You give something up in exchange for the result, but you really wish you never did have to give it up. So there's a difference between compromise and consensus. And most of the things that they came up with, and they resolved through consensus. For example, Governor Randolph stood up and said, I think there should be 3 presidents. One for the northern states, one for the central states, and one for the southern states. Because there's safety in numbers, he said. And all of a sudden, James Wilson of Pennsylvania stood up and said, safety in numbers? Governor Randolph, have you forgotten the 30 tyrants of Greece? You see, the 30 tyrants of Greece came into power just after the war with Spartan. And what happens when you have 30 people in charge and something goes wrong? Who gets the blame? The other 29. It wasn't me, right? It's these guys, right? And so they became tyrants. And so they talked through it and they worked through it. And finally, Governor Randolph said, you're right. A single executive would be the best way to go. So they came to consensus. It wasn't easy sometimes. In fact, they had over 60 ballots in order to determine how to elect the President of the United States. So they had to work through those things in great detail. But there were 3 major compromises. The first one, number 1, how soon the national government should begin to regulate or abolish slavery. Everybody there at the convention recognized that slavery had to be done away with. And they knew that it was a practice that we just needed to eliminate. The problem is that the southern states, it was so ingrained in their economy that they knew it was going to be very, very difficult. And even though people had even started running the calculations for them and showing them that slavery was really not all that profitable, that it just was not the best way to do things. But nevertheless, the southern states knew that they would never get this Constitution passed if they eliminated right out the gate slavery. And so the southern states said, just let us handle it on our own. We will not come into the Union if you force us, but let us handle it on our own. And the northern states said, okay, how much time do you need? They said, give us 20 years. There's 20 years to work it out. They said, all right. And they put it right in the Constitution, 1808. You cannot begin to regulate the importation of slaves until the year 1808. And so remember earlier when I said that there's one part of the Constitution that doesn't apply to today? That's it. Right? 1808 is passed, slavery doesn't exist, and so therefore that doesn't apply to today. But that was so important, that compromise. Both sides wanted to make sure that that thing was right there, that we'll find as we get to the amending article, that it's right there in the amending article that you cannot amend that date. And so that's how strong that compromise was. And so 1808, 20 years. Number 2, whether the votes in Congress should be according to the individual states or the population of the states. Population's your blank. See, the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote and one vote only. And if you had 5 delegates, those delegates got together and they voted to determine what that state's vote was going to be. But each state only had one vote. And so to James Madison, he thought that was incredibly unjust, because you have Virginia, that was the largest state by population, having the same amount of vote as, smaller state, Delaware or whatever. And so he said, this is totally unjust. The people in Virginia are not represented as much as the people in Delaware. And so James Madison said that both the House and the Senate should be based on population. And so that was one of the debates. And we'll go into more detail about that in just a few minutes. Number 3, whether the federal government should have authority to regulate interstate commerce. Commerce is your next blank. The southern states, for the most part, were doing better financially than the northern states, and so they really didn't want the federal government to regulate commerce. But they realized that somebody had to, and it had to be the federal government, because the states, they had learned from experience that 2 or 3 states would gang up against other states. And so interstate commerce had to be a federal thing so that everybody kind of had a say in this free flow of commerce. And as we get into the Constitution, we'll go into detail about interstate commerce. And so basically, those were the 3 major compromises. A few other small ones, but for the most part, they came to consensus. Now, there were a couple other plans that were presented. And so James Wilson of Pennsylvania compared the 2 major plans. One was the Virginia plan, the other was the New Jersey plan from William Paterson. We're not going to go through that in detail, but you can kind of compare that yourself there to see the differences between the plan. But then Hamilton had a plan. Hamilton's your blank for letter B. He stood up and presented this plan. And here's what he said. Number 1, a single executive would be chosen for life. Life is your blank. Number 2, senators would also be chosen for life. Some say they still are. Right? Number 3, members of the House of Representatives would be chosen for a term of 3 years. 3 is your next blank. And the governors of the states would be appointed by the federal government. Federal is your blank there. Just like the King of England had appointed colonial governors before the Revolutionary War. I love what Madison writes here. See, Madison took very, very detailed notes through the convention. And I love what he writes. He says, Hamilton's plan was approved by all and supported by none. So it was approved. They gave him they respected him, and so they, clapped and recognized that he's pretty good guy, but it wasn't even seconded. And so he was a little upset about that. It's one of the reasons why he left the convention early. He eventually came back. But on June the 19th, a moving speech was given by James Madison, your next blank, in which he said, we need to establish a constitution for the ages. And no other plan in existence right now has that. He says, but this plan, the Virginia plan, has got the principles that we need to include in our Constitution in order to have it last for the ages. So, after June 19th, the convention tried to probe into some of the more difficult questions. They kind of put those questions off. They handled all the easy things that they all agreed to, but things like population, representation, all that kind of stuff, they put that off. And there they entered into what we call the crisis period. Crisis is your next blank. In fact, as I'd mentioned, just trying to decide how the president should be elected required more than 60 ballots. 60 is your next blank. fact, this is what George Washington said here on the top of page 30. He said, "I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of the convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business." Whoa. What's he saying here? I'm sorry I came. I wished I hadn't even been involved with this. That's how bad it got. In fact, it states here, observers said that he looked as grim as he had at Valley Forge. He was really concerned that we weren't going to be able to figure this self-governance thing out. Then number 2 is during the quarreling and the heated debate on June 28th, the 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin made his famous plea for prayer. And this is that quote that I mentioned earlier, "Gentlemen, gentlemen." And it's fantastic how he says it. He says, how is it, groping, as it were, how have we forgotten to call upon God to illuminate our understanding? And he talks about how it's important that we now turn to it. He said, during the Great War with Great Britain, he said, we had prayer in this very room. And our prayers were heard and were graciously answered. And how have we now forgotten our most gracious friend? Or do we no longer think we need his assistance? And then that's when he goes into, the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And he went on to have this motion that they should start every morning with a word of prayer. Now, we'd love to stand up here and say, oh, the motion passed and everything was wonderful after that. Actually, the motion failed. And the reason why it failed is because in his motion he said that he wanted to pay a clergyman to come in and offer the prayer every morning. Well, the rules that they had already established at the very beginning was that no outsider was allowed to come in. They had boarded up the windows. They shut them all up. Nobody. Only the secretary and a couple errand boys were able to come in and out. And so that would violate one of their rules. The other thing is they didn't have any money to pay a clergyman. But Madison did record that all of them went about their work in a much more prayerful manner after that great speech that Franklin had given. And so it did change the course of the convention. So a breakthrough came on July 16th when the delegates were able to agree on a formula for representation. Representation is your blank there, in Congress. The small states had been determined to have one vote for each state, just like they had in the Articles of Confederation. One is your blank. But the larger states insisted that it be based on population, your next blank. In fact, delegates from Georgia argued that this would give the big state of Virginia 16 times more representatives than Georgia. But Madison argued back, but if we have a single vote for each state, then that would give Georgia 16 times more representation than us in Virginia. You see how that works? Because the population is 16 times more. And so if you do it by population, Virginia gets 16 times more. If you do it by just one vote, Georgia gets 16 times more. Either way, you have this imbalance. And so they had to try to figure out how to resolve this. Well, they finally agreed to the suggestion of Roger Sherman of Connecticut that each state have equals your blank for letter C, equal representation in the Senate, in the upper house, and then the House of Representatives be by population. Now, this is a really critical issue because here it is. We are now taking two forms of government and mixing them. There are great things about a democracy because where does all the power originate? From the people, right? And so the people have got to have a say. Our voice and our representation needs to be heard, and it should be heard for the most part equally. So that population representation was very important. And so the House of Representatives became our house, the people's house. And each one of us from state to state were represented relatively equal. And that became basically a form of democracy. So that House of Representatives became a democratic house. Of course, we're talking small d, we're not talking political parties here. And so House of Representatives, democracy. But then there are a lot of good things, important things about a republic. Now, a republic is when the people elect or appoint representatives to go up and basically make decisions for them. In a true republic, those people end up not having to answer back to the people, or at least not very often. And so the Senate became a form of a republic. And it actually had a buffer from the people. because originally the Senate was appointed by your state legislatures. So you voted in your state legislature, and then they voted in the Senate. So there's this buffer. So the Senate never had to come back and answer to the people. But what that also created is it created the people having representation in the House and the Senate representing the states. So now the states were strong and sovereign. And oh, James Madison fought this. Boy, he fought it because he thought it was totally unjust to have the states have an equal vote in either house. Now, he agreed that the number should be smaller in the Senate than in the popular House. But boy, he fought it until he suddenly realized this is an amazing creature that we have created. Something that has never been tried in the history of the world. Strong, sovereign states that have a voice in the federal government, that have veto power, essentially, in the federal government. But then the people being represented equally in that federal government as well. Brilliant, brilliant system. And so James Madison finally agreed to it, and the rest of the founders and delegates agreed to it as well. So once they were completed, they went ahead and appointed a committee on detail. Detail is your next blank. And they continued to kind of work out some of the details and things. But the committee on detail, basically, they were the ones that kind of started putting the structure of the Constitution together. It's pretty rough, kind of ugly, didn't sound all that great. By this time, 11, your next blank, 11 of the 55 delegates had gone home. The entire delegation from New York had gone home. They were so frustrated and angry, they said, we're out of here. Hamilton finally came back, but he ended up being the only delegate from New York there. So then on September 8th, they went ahead and gave this kind of final rough draft to the Committee on Style. Style is your next blank. Style. And the chairman of that committee was Gouverneur Morris. Morris is your next blank. And Gouverneur Morris was a great writer. And he's the one responsible for writing the preamble. And it's believed that he did most of the writing of the Constitution itself, the actual verbiage. So the Committee of Style, that was their job, was to take this rough, ugly outline and make it sound nice and eloquent and understandable so that it was easy to interpret. And so at that point, once they got all done with that, they were ready to unveil the Constitution, in which they felt like they had finally brought back the institutes of the Anglo-Saxons and codified it into a constitution and firmly placed the American eagle in the balanced center. Center's your next blank. Now you'll notice here with this chart, you have this American eagle. It's a three-headed eagle representing the three branches of government, all having to operate from the same neck, so they've got to cooperate. Checks and balances, right? And you'll notice that center eagle representing the legislative branch. Looking forward, it's two eyes representing the House and the Senate. Now, some people, you'll hear them say that they are separate and equal branches. They are not equal. The founders recognize that they are not equal. Which is the most powerful branch? The legislative branch. That's right, because it's power to tax, power to make law, right? And so it's the most powerful. That's why they separated it into two houses to give some additional checks and balances, okay? So it is much more powerful, that legislative branch. But then you look at this chart, and you'll see it's in the balanced center, right? And you'll notice the lines that come down, and they stop at the state governments. In the original Constitution, the federal government had no authority to touch you directly. They couldn't directly reach into your pockets and take your money. The direct taxes had to go flush through the states, right? And so they couldn't reach you directly, they couldn't regulate you directly, they couldn't tax you directly. Our states became our protector from an overreaching federal government. And our federal government became a protector of an overreaching state. It's great check and balance. Now, these are checks and balances that we don't talk about today. We call them vertical. That's your next blank. Vertical checks and balances between the state and the federal government. Vertical. What you're familiar hearing about is the horizontal, which is your next blank. So letter B is both vertical and horizontal. See, that's all you hear about in school, right? Just that horizontal, three branches. We don't talk a lot about the vertical separation of powers. But here's what James Madison said about that. He said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few, you're blank there, and defined. What does that mean if they're few and defined? It means you can list them, right? You can put them in a list. We can write them all down. He said, but those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Numerous. That's why many of our state constitutions are a lot longer than our federal constitution is. Okay? He said the former will be exercised primarily or principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. With the last, the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and prosperity of the state. So the states are to handle most of the things. The federal government is just external stuff, right? Mostly dealing with foreign nations and the relationship between the states. There's very, very few things in the Constitution that relate directly to you as an individual. Basically, it's a compact of the states, right? Of course, we've changed that quite a bit, haven't we? The founders provided a horizontal, that's your next blank, horizontal separation of powers among the three branches, legislative, executive, and judiciary. And so again, there's that eagle there placed in the balanced center between anarchy and tyranny. The founding fathers finally got it right. Articles of Confederation failed. Now, one last point here on property. You always know whether or not you've found the balanced center based on your property. This is really a pretty neat thing. If you don't have the total right and control of your property because of too much taxation, too much regulation, you know you're too far toward tyranny. If you don't have the total right and control of your property because of theft and fraud and things, you know you're too far toward anarchy. When you have the total right and control of your property, you know that you found the balanced center. Right? So very important to recognize property gives us this great gauge as to where we are in relation to our freedoms between anarchy and tyranny. So on Monday, September 17th, 1787, 41, you're blank there, 41 out of the original 55 delegates met in Independence Hall for the signing. Now, a few delegates still had some reservations. Franklin said that, I've got a couple issues with this, but, I'm not sure that it's not the best, he said. He said, the longer I live, he said, I realize that my views are faulty, and so I trust in the views of others. So he said, though I think that there's some imperfections here, I may be wrong, is what he's saying. He says, so I support this Constitution. But there are three people that were there that refused to sign it. Number one, Elbers Jerry, and some people pronounce it Gary, but I like to pronounce it Jerry, because this is the guy responsible for gerrymandering, right? This is in his state. They kind of changed the boundaries to get him into a certain district, and so this is where gerrymandering comes from. Okay, but he was of Massachusetts, George Mason of Virginia, and Governor Randolph of Virginia. So George Mason, toward the end of the convention, he stands up, and the document is essentially done. And he stands up and he said, I would rather cut off my right arm than to place it to that document. And James Madison said, but Colonel Mason, you've always been such a strong supporter of the things that are in this. Why, at this late hour, would you now say that you won't support this? And Colonel Mason said, because it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. But Colonel Mason, we haven't given the federal government enough power to trample our rights. And Colonel Mason's answer was classic. But they will. They always do. So, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights, which is your next blank for number 3, Bill of Rights, that's why these three individuals wouldn't sign it, which, of course, eventually a lot of other states were concerned about that as well. There's a couple of reasons why the founders didn't want a Bill of Rights in there and didn't write one. Number one, virtually all of the state constitutions already had a Bill of Rights. Number two, just like Madison said, we didn't give the federal government enough authority to trample on these rights. It's not within their, they can't. We didn't tell them that they could deal with religion. We didn't tell them that they could do anything with arms. We didn't tell them that they could, all these different things. And so because we've limited their authority, they can't even touch those things anyway. The other reason why they didn't want one is because they felt like the moment they put it into a federal document, the federal government would now have the authority to interpret it. That's a concern I have with a lot of the amendments that are being talked about today. Like, for example, the marriage amendment. If we put that marriage amendment in the federal document, then immediately the federal government now has the authority to define what that marriage amendment means. And so, of course, people will say, oh, but we'll make it so clear that marriage has to be between one man and one woman. Yeah, real clear, kind of like Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise. That kind of clear? See, they abuse it and they misinterpret it. And so you got to be very careful what you put in that federal document, even if it's a restriction, because the federal government now has the ability to interpret that. Okay, so we've got to be very cautious when we're amending that document. So as they were signing, James Madison carefully watched each one of them. And when Franklin signed, Madison wrote, "The old man wept." See, Franklin had been trying to unite the colonies for decades. And now he not only was able to see it toward the end of his life, but he was able to apply his wisdom to the proceedings. So it was a fantastic experience for Benjamin Franklin. And as the last delegates were signing, Franklin referred to a picture or a carving of a sun on the back of George Washington's chair. And he said, "I have often in the course of the session looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun." Benjamin Franklin always had this great wit and a great observation. And what a great observation he had here in this case, to recognize that this nation was a rising sun, and that we had a tremendous amount ahead of us as far as responsibility. Now, as the convention came to a close, it wasn't over. They then had to convince the rest of the nation that what they had put in this document was what this nation needed. And it was just an incredible battle. It took about a year and a half to get the states to accept it and ratify it. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the later lessons. Now, one thing that I do want to introduce you to before we conclude this lesson is The Making of America. Now, The Making of America is a textbook produced by the National Center for Constitutional Studies, and this is the granddaddy of them all. This is more time and money went into this book than any other book that NCCS produces. And it's a fantastic book. It primarily goes through a lot of the things that we've gone through today. It talks about some of the ancient civilizations and Anglo-Saxons, and kind of brings you through history. It handles the Revolutionary War beautifully, a lot better than we did in just going through those battles. And so just some fantastic stuff there. But once you get into the last two-thirds of the book, you'll notice these big bold headings, these numbers. And what Dr. Skousen and his staff did is they went through and they identified about 287 identifiable provisions, separate provisions in the Constitution. And they put what that provision is, and then they talk about it. But very, very little of this are their words. Most of this, you'll notice these bold names, Madison and Franklin and others. About 80% of the text in this book are the Founding Fathers telling you what those provisions mean. Why they did it the way they did it, why they rejected other systems and took this system, why all these different arguments. And so when you go through this entire book, you've not only been through the entire Constitution clause by clause, but you've been taught what each one of those clauses mean by the Founding Fathers themselves. Very, very powerful reference book to have on your bookshelf when you're needing to study and learn more about the Constitution. So if you read through and go through this book, you will have a sounder understanding of the Constitution than just about anybody else in this country, including your lawyers and politicians and things like that, especially them, right? Yeah, Supreme Court justices, absolutely. Now, at the beginning of the book, there's also one great thing in the back is a copy of the Constitution, but it's what we call Constitution at a Glance, and it has these bold headings that kind of tell you what's in that section. Those bold headings are not in the document itself, but they're there so you can very quickly go through and try to find certain areas. But at the beginning, you'll notice these pictures. These are some of the delegates that were there at the Constitutional Convention. And So there's a very, very short biography on them, just a quick paragraph on who they were, where they came from, what their profession was, maybe their age or whatever. But then there's a second paragraph on all those biographies. And you'll notice that paragraph is in quotes, because this actually came from one of the delegates, from Major William Pierce. Now, Major William Pierce was a delegate who did not give one single speech on the floor of the convention, but he took notes. But not like Madison and Yates and others that took notes. He didn't take notes about the issues and what we were debating and things like that. He took notes on who these people were, what their personalities were like, why people respected, why people didn't like them, why, all these different things, so their personalities. And so he goes through and explains some of these. So I want to read a couple of these to you. Gouverneur Morris, right? He's the one that was Committee on Style, wrote the preamble. Now, Gouverneur Morris gave more speeches on the floor of the convention than anybody throughout the convention. And he was an interesting character. He had a peg leg due to an accident. And it wasn't an artificial leg. It was literally just a peg leg like Long John Silver, right? And he used to keep it polished. And at that time, back when they would clap and applaud, they usually wouldn't do it clapping. They would knock on the table or hit the table. And what Gouverneur Morris would do is he would take that peg leg and just bang it up against that hard wooden floor. And boy, you knew when Gouverneur Morris approved of something because that was loud. And so he was quite a character. But this is what Major William Pierce, a delegate from Georgia, said about Gouverneur Morris, who is from Pennsylvania. One of the geniuses in whom every species of talents combine to render him conspicuous and flourishing in public debate. He winds through all the mazes of rhetoric and throws around him such a glare that he charms, captivates, and leads away the senses of all who hear him. Wow. An amazing speaker. No wonder he gave so many speeches on the floor of the convention, right? William Paterson. William Paterson was the one responsible for the New Jersey plan, right? And so sometimes people kind of don't look at him as highly, but he was great. He was brilliant. He became one of the first Supreme Court justices. And this is what Major William Pierce said about him. One of those kind of men whose powers break in upon you with great wonder and astonishment. He is a man of great modesty, with looks that indicate talents of no great extent. So he's great to listen to. Not much to look at, but he's great to listen to. Right. Roger Sherman, what a great man. Remember the Connecticut Compromise, Sherman's Compromise between representation in the House and Senate? He said, he deserves infinite praise. No man has a better heart or a clearer head. Just an amazing man. And then James Wilson of Pennsylvania. Remember 30 Tyrants of Greece, James Wilson? He ranks among the foremost in legal and political knowledge. He is well acquainted with man and understands all the passions that influence him. Government seems to have been his peculiar study. All the political institutions of the world he knows in detail and can trace the causes and effects of every revolution from the earliest stages of the Grecian Commonwealth down to the present time. Isn't that somebody you'd want on your team if you were writing a constitution? Great stuff. Now, we can't go through this without reading Benjamin Franklin. This is what Major William Pierce said about Benjamin Franklin. Well known to be the greatest philosopher of the present age. All the operations of nature he seems to understand. The very heavens obey him. And the clouds yield up the lightning to be imprisoned in his rod. He is a most extraordinary man. Pretty amazing, Benjamin Franklin. All right, the last one I like to read from Major William Pierce is about Major William Pierce. He wrote one on himself. Right? Here's what he said. First, he says that he's conscious of fulfilling his duties as a Revolutionary War soldier with honor and integrity. And then he goes on to say, the flattering opinion which some of my friends had of me gave me a seat in the wisest council in the world. What a humble statement. When I first said he wrote one on himself, you're thinking, oh, kind of arrogant, right? What a humble statement. And I think he kind of speaks for all the founders in this. The founders weren't there because it was a position of gain and glory. There was no gain and glory to be had. There was no money. They had to borrow money to get there. They were there because it was a position of honor. They were absolutely honored that their fellow men would elect them and would trust them to go and actually write their form of government. And so it's definitely a position of honor. And so I think that Major William Pierce reflected the opinion of all the founders that were there when he said, "The flattering opinion which some of my friends had of me gave me a seat in the wisest council in the world." What a great group of men that gathered together at the Constitutional Convention. We call it a miracle, and they called it a miracle. Most of the founders that have quotes and things about the Constitutional Convention said it was an absolute miracle. And so it was just a fantastic event in which, for the first time in history, a people sent their best and their brightest to work out their system of government, not with force or conquest, but with deliberate and with intelligent debates, and to try to figure out exactly the best form of government that we should have. And so it was really a remarkable thing, the miracle of America. Thank you.